many cases, historically spend a bit more on eating out and a bit more on experiences, which is not a bad thing, by the way, and getting the balance right about how much you spend on goods and how much you spend on experiences is, a bit of a life skill. Although it's worth saying that some goods are also experiences. It's not quite as simple as that. We spend obviously a lot more on education. In the US, they spend a lot more on healthcare. But effectively, housing, education, and healthcare have turned into this massive sponge, which just soaks up every drop of someone's discretionary income.
Well, I think it's interesting because you talk a lot about how much the prices of televisions and phones have come down. They've gotten better. I think one interesting point as well is that Elon Musk has probably the same iPhone as me. He might have the brand new one that's just come out, but there's not a higher grade one. So do you think it's just, that's just a success story that we managed to bring all these prices down whilst making that? Actually, there's a lack of innovation. Like, where is the hoverboard? Where is the stuff that should have been made that people don't bother? You
could right now have a device where I walk into my garden, even being a bit fat, and climb into a single-person pilotless drone, and it flies me somewhere 30 miles away. That technology is there. There's a company, Vertical Aerospace, and I think near Bristol. Now that one's actually piloted, but the whole idea of the air taxi is perfectly doable. What we have seen, I think, is far too much investment money ploughed into information technology rather than physical technology, simply because information technology effectively is very badly regulated, whereas anything that might have a physical risk to it. If you think about it, we all gave everybody smartphones without really any investigation of the mental risk that attached to owning a smartphone. But if I opened a drone delivery service like Manor, which they had in Dublin, the cat was frightened by a drone, I'd be subject to some sort of local council legislation or, So anything we try and do in the physical world. So we've completely... China, you might argue, might have got it the other way around, that the entire Politburo consists of male engineers, and they're absolutely obsessed with infrastructure, possibly to an excessive degree, because ultimately there's a limit to the number of bridges you can build to, create. But in the UK, we've completely lost our appetite for road building. Now, one great thing about a road, and when I think about it, when I think of all the new roads I know about, which are newly built, you can build houses along them, and yet we don't. Where I live in Wales, they built a new road between Raglan and Abergavenny. There is not a single off-ramp off that dual carriageway, which could lead to a place where somebody could live. Now, some of it's quite attractive countryside. I wouldn't want to blast a great big, a vast great housing development, but there are places which aren't that attractive, where you could totally easily build. Okay, and the great thing about a road is if you build along a road, you're not in someone's backyard. You're creating a new housing space, a new community, rather than always foisting a load of new residents on a pre-existing community. So our lack of appetite for, or reluctance to invest in things which are in any way physical, relative to things which are purely digital. If you look at the money being ploughed into AI, what would have happened if that had been ploughed into low-altitude aviation or cold fusion, whatever it might be? Some of those things would fail, but I think it's a grotesque over-concentration of investment capital in a small number of parts of the economy.
So you've been at the heart of this. I've heard your story about people shouting wanker at you for being one of the first people using a mobile phone on Oxford Street. You've been at the heart of this because you've been selling these concepts of a phone that you don't have to wire into people. Where did this go wrong? If two men on a podcast are talking about we could build houses out of different materials, and you could fix the housing crisis in a couple of weeks, and strap a drone on and fly off, and all these. Why is there no will to do that? Why are we stuck here just making the camera a little bit better on your phone and tinkering with a little bit of AI?
I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it might have been. I think it was Peter Thiel who said we were promised flying cars. We got 180 characters. And he's talking about the early Twitter when it was effectively SMS fed. Some of it's regulation, some of it's, again, a desperate bid by people to make a digital land grab, which is similar to the kind of American westward expansion, only it's technological rather than physical. If you can create a networked business, a business that exploits network effects, you can create a kind of effective monopoly where the profits are. The potential for wealth extraction is enormous. And it worries me enormously the extent to which Amazon, Meta, and Google, between them, effectively can extract a disproportionate part of the value from any transaction that takes place on their platform. The extent to which someone making something and selling it to another person, by dint of having to go through this gatekeeper in the shape of one of those three entities, either in terms of finding a customer or in terms of effectively playing host to the transaction, can more or less charge fees that are not, that are the greater part of the putative profit that's made by, the seller in that transaction. That strikes me as fundamentally terrifying, because it's like having a local, I grew up, my ancestors are Welsh farmers, it's like having the person who owns the market, where you sell your cows, can basically go, ooh, that's a nice pedigree Charolais bull, I think I'll charge you 400 quid to sell it.
Yeah.
Now, had you done that in, Abergavenny or Monmouth back in 1930, people would have buggered off and found a separate market somewhere else. And you can do that with 1,000 people or 3,000 farmers. You can just go, this market's a total rip-off, we'll found a market of our own. You can't really do it with a million people. You can't, if you look at the effort to get people to leave X/Twitter and move to Blue Sky, it doesn't really work, it's simply too difficult. And also, consumers aren't paying this cost directly, so it's invisible to them. But how much cheaper would those goods on Amazon be if they weren't paying so much money to Amazon?
This is true.
So in other words, things you can migrate from being a property developer to a property developer to a renter to a slum landlord. If you've got this effective sort of stranglehold over a particular location, and in the same way, you can go from being a valuable online service to effectively a protection racket. And there are things online which, to me, are not advertising. They strike me as closer to a protection racket. Like Amazon will tell you, if you pay us some money, we won't put the Amazon Basics product above your own on the search rankings. Is that advertising?
Yeah. Well,
that sounds more like Paulie in Goodfellas than it does like David Ogilvy, to be absolutely honest.
Yeah.
David Ogilvy.
I wanted to move on to advertising as a topic. As you say, I work in PR, you work in advertising. I guess the first one I want to go into is actually about AI. And is AI a friend or a foe when it comes to creativity? Because I've done it myself now. Rather than spend time Googling or whatever, just go into AI, be like, this is what I'm looking for. Give me 3 options. And, I'm not so much looking at adverts and thinking, oh, that's a good idea. And also, I'd say that aspirational culture of me seeing something and thinking, oh, that's cool, isn't really there as much anymore. I think people are a little bit more logical thinkers, maybe because they have to be more careful with their money. What do you think that AI has a big potential for advertising, or do you think it is stifling the creativity a little bit?
It has high potential to be very valuable and high probability of being disastrous. Right. This is my take on it. The reason I'm pessimistic is not, well, it's only partly to do, there are terrifying prospects in terms of the potential to use AI to do individual harm. I mean, drone terrorism is something we haven't given enough thought to. But once you can effectively program something in advance to do harm and walk away, okay, that was a bomb with a timer, which was an extraordinary breakthrough. You know, in the early days of anarchism, you had to carry a bomb, throw it at someone, and run it away. Then you had the bomb with a timer, which was, or in some cases, I think in aviation, the bomb with a kind of altitude sensor or whatever. That was an extraordinary kind of technological breakthrough for anybody who was interested in doing nefarious things. If you have a thing you can program, so it sits there, and then 3 days later takes off and flies into a building. You know, a driverless car is potentially a cruise missile on wheels. So that terrifies the life out of me.
So my dad and I had a 3-hour conversation about drone terrorism and why we're not being careful. But I think it's they will do something about it when something happens. I think that's the situation they're in. That they won't
know.
Preempt it.
But I mean, but at some level, AI has the potential to empower human beings to make them better. It could make a pretty good doctor as good as a very good doctor. So that's what I call a qualitative improvement. However, AI costs money, much more than, say, you know, the early internet cost money in terms of the investment in data centers and everything else. The companies will need to make their money back. How do you sell an expensive product to a business? You sell it on the basis of cost savings. How do you make cost savings? You promise to get rid of their workforce. And what do companies want to do who want to impress their shareholders in the short term? The fastest way you can ever create a profit out of nowhere in term is by slimming down your workforce. And if you have a plausible narrative, which is where if previously, you know, if you were slimming down your workforce, you had to explain to your investors why it was you were slimming them down. What possible means made it possible for you to slim down your workforce? Now, for that, you don't need the truth. You just need a plausible story. And if every single company on the planet, that's a PLC or you know, Fortune 500 company, has this plausible story which can say we're going to make spectacular wage savings owing to the deployment of AI, and the people in the investor community believe that story, then that's what you're going to do. And so to justify your expenditure on AI, which most companies seem to be engaging in, the only way or rather the easy, you could justify it the slow way, which is to say we will be able to provide a higher quality service, which means that more people will buy our goods and profits. But that's a much more nebulous promise than we're going to lose 10,000 staff. And so consequently, the way in which AI will be used will, I think, to a large extent be used by public limited shareholder-owned companies as a way to some extent to game their own investors, by allowing them to claim that the short-term profit gains that arise through getting rid of people are in fact sustainable because of this magical technology, even when that isn't true. So no, I'm terrified because most businesses effectively spend most of their time trying to reduce their wage bill, because in most modern service economy, that's by far the biggest part of your cost. That's not true in aluminium smelting or, you know, heavy industry or mining or whatever. It certainly wasn't true in the 1920s when labour costs were very low. But that's basically what's going on now.
Well, it's interesting because I guess it's how far out do you want to take a vision of it? Because I guess at the same time we're also being told we've got a population crisis. There'll be no one here in 30 years. So actually, will we need to rely on the tech to do jobs because we simply don't have the people?
You could create a bigger leisure economy, and you could do a Henry Ford, just as Henry Ford sort of, inverted commas, creating the 2-day weekend, partly because he thought that if it took off, it'd be worth Americans buying a car once they got 2 days off at the end of the week. You could make a call and just say, actually, let's have a slightly more intelligent trade-off between work and leisure. You might argue that it'd be interesting to know what proportion of Americans would be happy earning a bit less if they also had to work a bit less. You could equally say, well, once you get down to 2 or 3 days a week of work, people who are really short of money could do 2 jobs. What that looks like will be, I think, a mixture of horrible and quite nice. You know, and there are an awful lot of things to me that strike me about the future and about technology that are kind of horrible and nice. So Airbnb, for example, is a business. At one level, it means that, you know, a farmer near where I grew up can turn a stable into a small holiday cottage, not one where anybody would want to live, but you can rent it out to Airbnbers. The farmer now has a new source of income. The consumer now has a new place to stay. I think we can all agree that's probably net positive. And he wouldn't have bothered doing up the place anyway, otherwise. By contrast, if you take something like central Barcelona, where it's more profitable to rent a 2-bedroom apartment for 17 weekends a year to Airbnbers than it is to rent it to a full-time local occupant, then it's a huge problem, because you end up with the centre of a city being completely hollowed out, and you sit there at a Barcelona cafe surrounded by other Airbnbers watching people wheel suitcases past your cafe. That's not Barcelona anymore, is it? So it's one of those things where, you know, an awful lot of these things, we effectively they arrive and we make our own uses for them. We can't really predict what's going to happen, I think. Now, the other prediction I will make is that that AI will be slower to find its absolute perfect role than we like to think. It's like the Gartner hype cycle or something like that, in that we have a period of maximum hype, and then there's a kind of, you know, the trough of disappointment, and then, rather like the QR code, you know, fashionable, falls out of favour, finds its niche during COVID to a large extent, and then, I think we'll see increasing ingenious uses of QR codes over the next 5 to 10 years. And I rather suspect that AI will adopt a similar pattern, because it's a common enough pattern. Because to make something really useful, people need to change their behaviour, and behaviour change is slow. It's slow and it's also uneven. It doesn't arrive simultaneously. It has to permeate through a population. You know, it's almost a process of percolation, if you like. And I've got one of my interesting kind of theories about this is there's a kind of paradox in innovation, which is that fairly trivial innovations get adopted very quickly. The iPhone 6 as opposed to the iPhone 17 instead of the iPhone 16. It's basically the same thing but a bit better. It doesn't demand huge behavioural change for you to move from an iPhone 15 to an iPhone 17. Basically the same shit but a bit better. I mentioned this road from Raglan to Abergavenny, where I grew up. There was already a road from Raglan to Abergavenny, and they built a new faster road alongside the old road, and almost instantaneously, everybody who wanted to go to Abergavenny switched to the new faster road, because they were already going to Abergavenny. There was just a better way of doing it. But then there's another form of innovation, which is you build a road into the middle of nowhere, or you build a road that connects 2 places that have previously not been well connected. Now, an example of that would be High Speed 1. Most people in Margate didn't work in London because it was a 2-hour train ride before High Speed 1 came along. I used to use High Speed 1 in its early years, and the trains were practically empty. I mean, there were times where you had a carriage to yourself. Now it's rammed, but it's taken 10 years for people to effectively adopt the new behaviours and working and living patterns that take advantage of High Speed 1. So here's the problem. You do something which is essentially incremental, and everybody goes, ooh, that's better, I'll do that right now. But you're not really changing behaviour very much, but you are getting an instantaneous hit. you do something which is significantly innovative, which makes it possible for people to do something they weren't able to do before. And weirdly, the pace of adoption is strangely slow. I mean, there was a 10, 15-year period where mobile phones were seen as very high-end business devices for incredibly important salespeople, or something of that kind.
What do you think is the biggest missed opportunity in recent times? Because I always felt that once we sort of got out of COVID, but people were still working from home, I don't understand why struggling pubs have not basically effectively created WeWorks until 5 o'clock. Just let everyone have free Wi-Fi, maybe free coffee. You've got local people actually connecting again, probably doing a bit of business and networking. And then 5 o'clock hits and they start serving the booze. People will probably stay.
I mean, for example, pubs are weird because they don't sell vapes. They're open till 11 o'clock. Okay, why don't they just sell vapes? It's a whole source of bloody, high margin revenue. Why don't they sell milk? Why doesn't the pub just have a fridge and it just becomes normal that it can act like a bit of a village shop for places where the village shop doesn't stay open late? You only have to sell 20 things: loo roll, milk. There's sort of 20 essentials, nappies, that kind of thing, which you really can't do without. I don't fully understand why that hasn't happened. I mean, other areas of, I always thought Google Glass was actually a very good idea, and I think Zuckerberg seems convinced also with his Meta Ray-Bans that the future, effectively the next interface, will not be a phone or a tablet or a laptop, but it'll be a pair of spectacles. And I have to say, I'm not his biggest fan, but that strikes me as a not altogether insane bet on the future.
Yeah. I have to ask you, because we're coming up to time, we've talked about a lot of things on this podcast, and I would say probably all coming back to sort of missed potential. We could have been in a really different situation. But
we don't know. In fact, we don't know what the world would have been like if everybody basically left the internet more or less as it was in about 1999 and invested in drone transportation or house building or. Yeah. My point about house building is if you view it by comparison with something, let's face it, more complicated like car building or ship building, it is just comically shit. I mean, you could literally, when I said you could have an episode of Grand Designs where you basically go, put it over there, I'm not entirely exaggerating, you could indeed do that. Yeah. There will be a few cases. The other thing is prefabricated homes, by the way, existed after World War II. The odd thing is, when I was a child in the 1970s, some of them still survived. When you drove in from the Cold River to Newport Station, you passed about 5 or 6 of these surviving prefab houses. The interesting thing is, you would have expected them to be shit, right? But actually, the owners, seemed to love them and took great care of them. Now, maybe that was just the generation in part, but it's not impossible to build a posh trailer park. There is Pamela Anderson, I think, I've got a vague memory. There's this thing in Malibu, which is, there's a trailer park near a beach in Malibu where the plots kind of cost $1 million or whatever it may be, I can't remember. But it's not impossible to turn prefabricated housing into what you might call high quality accommodation. We've sort of demonized the trailer park, if you like, but fundamentally there's an idea there, and that's one of the advantages. It seems like an advantage, but it's a sort of benefit that Americans have, that there is that housing of last resort. Another question I'd like to ask, by the way, is there are lots of young people, single or maybe in a couple, who would settle for a very, very small flat equivalent to student, an individual student room. That is designated student housing, and only students can live there. Well, why? Okay. What is it? The government has said, you see that apartment block over there? Are you a nurse? Do you do a useful job? Do you work in PR? Whatever it may be. Are you actually part of the active economy? No, you can't live there. But if you're studying Anglo-Saxon poetry, yeah, go and live there. What the fuck's going on there? Why is it student housing? If you built housing and you believe in free markets, anybody should be allowed to live there. But for some weird reason, they've designated, no, it's student housing. We can't have ordinary members. Now, a lot of single people, if you're not in a relationship, it's bloody difficult to find a nice place to live. Almost, virtually impossible with one salary.
Oh, I think that's insane. Honestly, the amount of people that I hear about in the 80s and 90s that had their own place, and that was just normal. Now it's just, you couldn't do that. You have to get 3 or 4 roommates together and share a 4-bed.
Oh, and that's if you've got mates. Okay, if you haven't got, I'm not going to dispute. People who don't have that kind of social network around them end up in a house of multiple occupancy with a bunch of strangers. One of my sister's friends is just getting aggressive. Okay, so she's moved in with someone she didn't know. Okay. Now, she's getting emails from not even the landlord, but the other earlier tenant, who is now, because I think she is the prior tenant, is taking on this kind of, I suppose she's subletting it in some shape or form. So she's taking on this massively proprietorial attitude to the property. And she's sending my daughter's friend photographs of the dishwasher. This is the dishwasher. Did nobody remember to put it on last night?
Oh,
and, who has put something in the washing machine that takes 3 hours to wash? Well, that's a cotton wash. I wouldn't do one personally. But someone put the washing machine on a wash like cotton, which took 3 hours. And they're these passive aggressive. Now, living in that situation, you're not, you're effectively under the thumb of whoever the most neurotic person in the household is. That's no way to live at all. So the only solution is to tax property. It's to tax the unimproved value of land, so that the business of land ownership is no longer extractive, because it comes with an obligation to society that if you're going to extract money from society, you can pay something back.
So I just wanted to end on then. I know that you think that doing podcasts, you should get to recommend one product or service. Which product or service would you like to recommend to end on?
I'll recommend any of those EcoFlow. No, actually Starlink.
Starlink?
Yeah, the Starlink Mini for a couple of £100, which you can actually power with a sort of portable laptop charger for about 4 or 5 hours, and then you get 250 megabits down and about 30 to 40 up. The only thing I can say is it's genuinely extraordinary.
Rory Sutherland, thank you so much.
Absolute joy. Thank you very much indeed.
Subscribe for more content.
Rory Sutherland, welcome.
That's a pleasure to be here. Fantastic.
I'm really pleased. Tell me, who is Rory Sutherland?
If you've heard of me, or the reason I'm here, I suppose, is the question I'm going to answer there, is I suppose all I did, in truth, was take some habits of thought and mental practices which are relatively common within the advertising industry or within marketing, and repackage them to be used elsewhere. That's about it, really, in a sentence.
Went rather well for you, though.
So, well, I mean, bizarrely, my argument would be it was an extraordinary failing of both marketers and advertising people to have missed this opportunity, for the most part, up until now. But what I suddenly discovered is that there's something quite unusual about what is the standard mental practice within the creative realm of marketing, which is in most of business, sort of rationality is the gold standard. If you come up with a rational argument which holds water, then tick, job done, nothing to see here, fantastic, all over. in advertising or marketing, rationality is kind of the bronze standard. Well, yeah, that makes sense, but are you sure we can't do something better?
Did you make a conscious decision to almost go against the grain? Because at some point you must have turned with the tide.
By the way, I don't think that's unique to advertising people. I think it's an entrepreneurial characteristic as well, which is bureaucratic, technocratic, managerial people whose motivation is self-justification. Okay? Generally want to think the way other people think and know what everybody else does, so they can benchmark against themselves and look rational and sane and make decisions that are unlikely to get you blamed. What I notice about the entrepreneurial mindset is it's completely the opposite. It only really values information that nobody else has.
Hence pioneers, innovators, disruptors.
So property developers, in a sense, what they're looking for is not value, it's untapped value or undervalued property, or in other words, the question is not what is this, but what can I make of it? And that's a fundamentally creative question. It's not a rational question. You know, there isn't a process by which you can arrive at that. It requires some sort of inspiration, or I think there's a technical term for it in philosophy, which I think is called abductive inference. It's a kind of what if rather than the what is. And I think, you know, fundamentally, I think you'll notice out of anybody who has an entrepreneurial mindset, not everybody's an entrepreneur, some of them are actually to be found scattered around in larger businesses. What you might call their approach to information is fundamentally different. It's opportunity-based, in a sense, rather than defensive. You know, most people in business optimize for efficiency rather than optimizing for opportunity.
Yeah, at the heart of that is creativity.
And fundamentally, of course, those people are uncomfortable with creativity because it usually involves something which isn't, strictly speaking, a process in the conventional sense of the word. You know, now, I think if you want to be creative, I think there are checklists. I think there are tools you can use, you know, whack packs you can use to stimulate creativity. I mean, Brian Eno famously produced a whole deck of cards called Oblique Strategies. You know, Rick Rubin's written about this in his new book. But it isn't a reliable deterministic process which frightens the shit out of certain people, particularly people in finance. Because you go, what will this... You know, if you do something fundamentally new, there is not data to predict what will happen.
That's the mathematical brain malfunctioning without process, without
You've got it,
structure.
and it fundamentally discomforts them. Because they're optimizing for predictability and low variance and all those sort of things. Whereas, in a sense, the phrase I used, and by the way, I don't play either, but generally you don't find entrepreneurs in chess clubs, you find them in casinos. In other words, you know, they have a fundamentally different statistical frame, I think, which they bring to the world. I mean, one of the interesting things is that you, in a sense, if you do gamble, and I have done it periodically, if you play poker or you play blackjack, what you realise pretty quickly is that you've been playing all evening, but in fact, 5 or 6 hands determine most of the outcome. It's fat-tailed. And I think, you know, entrepreneurs like that, they're happy to fail 15 times because what they're interested in is, if I can just be disproportionately successful on 4 occasions, I don't need to worry about all the other. And that's probably a mindset which is too scary for someone who wants an absolutely kind of granular measurement of cost and return.
And see the path.
Every penny I spend must be moving the pebble forward. Whereas the other mentality is I'm totally happy to spend a load of money not moving the pebble at all if sometimes something remarkable happens.
That's another way of articulating that. There's an optimism. You mentioned property.
You have to be disproportionately optimistic.
I'm a frustrated property developer right now, and you know, you ultimately are looking.
My father's a property developer. My daughter works for JLL. My daughter's effectively in the property development arm. It's a very creative world because, as I said, it's spotting, effectively seeing what other people haven't seen as the only way you can make money.
I love that you said that, and that's what drew me into it. Plus, I could see that apart from the barrier to entry being finance, and actually being able to buy property and fund through the development side of things, that was something I could see was a human part of it. That was not a mathematical science degree or what have you. That was actually where I just go to people, and the skill will be I'll find people that can get me good opportunities. I'll find people that can help shape them, and I'll find people that can fund them.
It's one of the reasons I repackage kind of AdThink or MadThink for other industries. It occurred to me that the people in advertising and marketing are overwhelmingly concentrated in fields like packaged goods, Unilever, Procter & Gamble, spirits, drink. Probably, you know, all of that is kind of 5% of GDP. And there are these other industries like transportation, infrastructure, real estate, which between them are probably 20% of GDP, but they receive less marketing attention than, say, Unilever does or Dove does. And it strikes me that those habits of thought that are found in marketing people might be equally valuable in the property sphere. And so my daughter and I were having this conversation just the other day. And I think the property industry, because let's face it, residential London property particularly is very soft at the moment and doesn't, you know, I don't think you can rely on capital appreciation anymore from property ownership in large parts of the country. And when you think about that, suddenly whole areas of activity like buy-to-let, once you don't have assumed capital appreciation, they're a mug's game.
And there was a graph that was a constant.
It was constant. And actually, there are a whole bunch of people. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, what was it? I think it was 1888, was it? It was a really bad. You're too young to remember this.
I remember it.
But there were absolutely dire property crashes in commercial and residential property from time to time. But there are a hell of a lot of people now who aren't even aware that can happen. They're also confident of the fact that they're never going to be taxed because there are too many of them. And so we've created a sacred asset class in real estate. And you know, all of that could change because if loads of people exit buy-to-let, which demographically a lot of them want to do anyway, given the age of the typical buy-to-let landlord, and they suddenly realise, okay, I'm not getting capital appreciation anymore in time to move out. You could have a fall in property prices, but also a huge increase in rental prices because a whole load of currently privately rented accommodation disappears from the market. So there's the potential for something quite scary, I think.
No, you're absolutely right.
But it really interests me because one of the things I said is if we do have, effectively, you can no longer basically build it, sit on it, wait for it to go up in value. You'll need a hell of a lot more marketing to sell property developments. And I was just joking to my daughter, and she said, well, what everybody in property does is if something isn't selling, they drop the price. I said, well, in marketing, in economics, that's the most rational thing you can do. You know, we can't sell it at 450, so we'll drop it to 420. And I said, in marketing terms, that's the worst thing you can do. Bribing someone to buy something is the most expensive way to sell something. And I said, let's play with some games, like go to Transport for London and see if you can bundle 7 years of travel card in with the property. Because that might cost you a lot less and actually be more motivating. You know, it'd be quite nice if you bought a property and you're basically told, okay, buy this property, both of you will not have any commuting costs for 7 years. That might be much more motivating than the equivalent reduction in the purchase price. And so one of the interesting questions is, will we need to bring back real marketing expertise to the property market? There was a lot of it, by the way, in the 19th century. All of those places, okay, if you take Bayswater, Fitzrovia, they're all branded. And all of those developed West Kensington. Okay. South Kensington, by the way, was never called South Kensington, it was called Brompton. And then when they built the Victorian Albert Museum and the Science Museum, they realised, well, Brompton sounds like a village. It doesn't sound very cool. So they decided to call it South Kensington. I mean, North Kensington is not even contiguous with Kensington.
I was based in South Kensington for 10 years. I didn't even know that.
No, it was Brompton, and it was kind of like a out of town shopping centre kind of place. And so they rebranded it South Kensington basically to make it sound a bit more shishi to get people to go to the museums. And all of those places, Pimlico, Bayswater was going to be called Tyburnia by analogy with Belgravia because it was near Tyburn. And there was really, really ingenious marketing went into 19th century or 18th century building. You had to brand the whole area.
Fertility
and of course, people did that joke when they referred to Clam or in other words, they renamed something. And my hunch is that obviously that happened when you had very large scale developments. They were branded. I would love to see architecture and design more heavily front foot in property and location.
Fertility is down in all countries. I don't know if every country, is it every country or is it just South Korea and Japan?
All the gains go to the landowner, not to the developer.
Fertility.
If you actually have, now I
in every country.
There's a development by Pininfarina. In other words, they've taken a famous car designer and they've applied the name to the property development. And so you're actually selling it on the basis of its design, aesthetics, and hopefully functionality.
Low declining fertility is a global phenomenon. Extreme in places like South Korea and Japan.
Actually, then the developer makes the money, or the person who licenses the brand or both. Whereas if you genuinely make it all about location, then basically the landowner makes all the money, and then the developer takes all the risk.
Low total fertility rates have dropped in every region in the world since 1950.
To ask you so many questions and actually be talking about property
from
development,
about 5 children per woman
the
to
stimulation
2.
and the enjoyment came from piecing all the people together, and then actually getting real traction and doing really big numbers in the space. But the planning, the politics, and I've got no issue with overcoming obstacles, but just the time delays and the lack of communication and the lack of this sort of lack of stimulation, curiosity. Sorry,
also think that the buildings are
an
architect. I had a full-time architect employed. We were not able to be creative architecturally. We had to conform to the precedent set over there. You put something else in front of it.
My argument is, I live in the roof of a Robert Adam house, which is converted into apartments. And at least when I doled out the actually not very high 6 stories on the bar, I go,
it's a global phenomenon.
There are only. I think I'm right in saying there are something like 6,000 Grade 1 buildings in the UK. Now, something like 4,000 of them are churches. Of the rest, about half of them are things you can't live in, like the Royal Opera House or Nelson Scotland. So there are only about 1,500 Grade 1 buildings in the UK where you can actually live, and I live in one of them. And the premium I paid for that was basically zero. It's the same per square foot as a boring thing built by a jobbing architect in the same location, 800 yards away. My insight was the cheapest way to buy art is to buy architecture.
And
imagine a world where you could get, it's a 6x9 canvas. Oh, that's nice. Yeah. Who painted on it? Well, that one's Picasso and that one's by a bloke next door, and they're the same price. And you suddenly realise there's this really weird thing, which is we've completely failed to capture an aesthetic premium in property. Now, Dr. Schroeder-Bernarzi, very brilliant UCLA behavioural economist, he argues that quality of design and aesthetics are an enduring contribution to your happiness. If you live somewhere that's beautiful and well designed, it's a form of pleasure it's a gift that keeps on giving, to use a marketing phrase. And if you've got a beautifully designed house where someone has put real thought into both the functionality and the aesthetics, it will contribute to your happiness in a way that's your environment. And yet no one pays
so South Korea has the lowest fertility rate in the world.
There's a building in, obviously because it's Notting Hill, it's bloody expensive. There's a growpiest building in Notting Hill, which is no more expensive than the building next door. So it even applies to modern architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright buildings are no more expensive than random buildings nearby. No, what I'm saying is
China's fallen too. You used to have an overpopulation
and also, most houses are really boring. And my only theory is it's the same reason as to why most cars are a really boring colour.
China's total fertility rate is
because people buy cars on personal contract
per children.
The garage, technically, you can go to the car manufacturer and say I want it in pink. The garage, who knows that they will be basically
UK fertility rate is 1.4
so they'll be left with this
or 1.5
effectively
children
difficult to
per
sell
woman.
pink car in 4 years' time. So they do everything they can to
Okay, so
get
it's
a black one,
higher.
a silver one, or whatever it is. Now, in the case of property,
It's rising overall
interesting
because of
property is much
migration
harder to
and
sell.
increasing
It might be
life
nicer to live in,
expectancy.
but it's harder and slower to sell than boring property. Consequently, since people buy property for its investment value, not for its use value, in other words, they're really buying the property in order to make money on it, not to enjoy living in it. As a consequence of that, people want to buy boring. Now, this is my theory. But people actually want a boring house because they want something that's easy, that's liquid, easy to sell. Go and buy a lighthouse. Okay, a much more interesting place to live, but it's a living nightmare to sell. And then estate agents are also not interested because they know it'll take a long time to sell, and it'll require a particular kind of buyer. So we're genuinely optimizing for boring. Because they should. If you look at how a car has improved, and the fact, all architects should commit suicide ritually on the basis that I, who's a technology-obsessed, kind of futurist, choose to live in an 18th century house. That should bring shame on the entire architectural profession. That when was my house built? 1781, I think. Right. Okay, so it's literally got 250 years. In 250 years, no one's come up with a house that I'd rather live in.
He brought cars up. I haven't bought an electric car. Is there an element of I was at Westminster?
Oh, go buy an electric car. They're fantastic. Ignore the whole environmental stuff. You will be helping the planet, but that's not the point. They're just much better cars.
But they're all starting to look the same. We met in the pit lane. Yes, the British Grand Prix, an absolute hub of innovation and sort of refinement to try and get the sort of edge over the competition. And by default, wings and little things are popping up, which is where my kind of conversation is going on. That sort of stimulating creativity. Whereas
there's 5 to 10 years. There's a thing in design called MAYA, M-A-Y-A, which is maximally advanced yet acceptable, which I think was coined by Raymond Loewy. And when you come up with something genuinely innovative, it has to have familiar elements to the person buying, because if you're too weird, it's too difficult. So that's why, for example, a digital camera goes click. It doesn't need to go click. digital, but if you have a camera, because it doesn't click, it weirds people out. So the early stages of electric cars, I think, have to have that, in the same way that digital radios used to have dials. It's called skeuomorphic. It's called a skeuomorphism, which is the incorporation of an element from an earlier technology, which only is there to add ease of familiarity and ease of adoption, rather than for any functional reason. And Greek temples had it. So even though they hadn't been built of wood for 50 years, they still had these weird things called, I think, metops, where the stone is carved as though there's a beam. As though there's like a chamfer joint or whatever it might be. And it's kind of like, it's a carryover from and actually, I would argue that most electric cars are a bit boringly conventional, but there's a limit to how, it came from, I think, a Raymond Loewy thing where he produced an electric fan that was completely silent. Now, logically, that was a brilliant thing to do, but it completely weirded people out. People kind of go, this fan isn't working, it doesn't cool me down, because you expect a fan to make a noise. And therefore, if you have a fan that's completely silent, effectively, it's a bit similar to that uncanny valley thing. It just weirds people out. But in time, what we'll see with electric cars, I think, will be really, really interesting, a kind of Cambrian explosion of innovation, one of them being very small forms of electric transportation. The Heathrow pod, I'm a big advocate of that. I think it's a fantastic form of transport, not least because people really enjoy riding in it, and also because of something we can't say, which is we love our own private mode of transport. So a lot of people don't take public transport. No, somebody said, a conservative politician once said it, that people prefer their cars because you don't have some smelly stranger sitting next to you. He could have also added that there's something lovely about getting, if you've been on a plane for 12 hours and you get to that Heathrow car park and you climb into your car, you can, there are all kinds of things you can do in private, and there's that glorious feeling of decompression when you're no longer in a public space. And we always joke about this. I was saying there must be a German word for it, which is the joy of climbing back into your own automobile after spending time in a public environment. And it's like that time when you kind of leave a party and you get into your car. I got upgraded to first class once on a flight back from, I think it was New York. It was British Airways first class. Fine wines, Belgian chocolates, the finest wines of humanity, the whole world. And it was magnificent. But the best bit of the whole journey was getting back into your own car. Nothing matches that feeling of, right, I'm finally in my own car, I'm autonomous, I'm private, nobody can bother me, I'm safe. So, one of the interesting things I think will be micromobility. And by the way, we can include scooters in that, we can include, cargo bikes, deserve to be included in that. Electric bikes are really important. But also, there's a thing called a microlino, which is modelled on the Italian bubble car of the 1960s, actually Swiss made. There's a dealership on the Cromwell Road, I think. And I give my daughter absolutely strict instructions not to let me go past that dealership while I'm drunk, okay? Because I just wander in and I'm impulse and buy one of these crazy little electric.
You're like 4 in order already.
No. But I think what happens is that if you want people to transition from one powertrain to another, give them one thing to cope with at once. If you also give them a really weird car, behavioural change is difficult and people find that frightening. And so there is an element. Now, in fairness, I think electric cars are, some of them, I bought a Lotus Electro recently, which is, I think, really, really interesting from a design point of view. Actually too big, but I quite like that. But actually, I quite like the fact that when you've got a confession, one of the reasons you have people drive these big cars is that it makes driving a bit difficult. I know it sounds completely counterintuitive, but it's so easy to drive a small modern car on British roads that there's a little bit of me which thinks that actually the sense of accomplishment you felt from getting somewhere,
so the challenge,
adding a small degree of difficulty might make something more enjoyable. I'm not quite sure, but it's a fantastic car in terms of its design and the effort put into the functionality. I actually bought the minimalist base model precisely for the aesthetics.
只有这个原因，好吧？ 但是好
I
像
think
是男生。
15 years time, we'll start to see genuinely a kind of explosion of different forms of transport.
但是我觉得
which is made possible just by the electric motor, which you can miniaturize, which is
这
actually
应该
extremely
不是
reliable, which
足
has very
够
few
的
moving
原因
parts.
喜欢一
And
个
so,
人吧。
I mean, if you think about it, golf carts were always electric for a very simple reason. And actually, golf carts would be kind of horrible if they had a petrol engine. The petrol engine would be probably two-stroke and nasty and so on.
It'll be a quad bike, wouldn't it?
So, and actually, electric motorbikes are going to be something else, right? In terms of performance, it's going to be extraordinary. So, no, I'm forgiving the car industry for that because you have to take the consumer with you. But the property industry, the level of boringness. So, I wrote a piece in The Spectator about this, which is, let's say you're a really, really successful lawyer in London and you're earning 6 figures. And you're thinking of buying a house in Fulham. Now, there are all the things you can spend your money on that have been invented since 1910, okay? Get to travel, charter a yacht. Think of the things you could do with sort of £900,000, right? The creative, amazing things you can do, extraordinary technological developments. But what you're doing when you're buying a house in Fulham, a successful corporate lawyer earning 6 figures, is you're saying, I know what I'm going to do for the next 25 years. The vast majority of my discretionary income is going to be spent owning a place which a postman would have lived in 1910. Now, all I'm saying is, I'm not saying go and buy a Bugatti Veyron and sleep in a tent, okay? Actually, I'm a bit. Because if you look at what you get for 6 figures in the car market, it's a work of art. It's something magnificent. It's, hundreds of PhDs have put all their intelligence into designing this thing, and it's genuinely magnificent. Louis XIV, if he saw a car or a flat screen TV or an internet terminal, would give you half of Gascony in return for just the telly with a Sky package. And yet we pay sort of £40 a month for that and grumble about it. The one thing Louis XIV wouldn't understand genuinely about today, he would look at these people and go, look at the wealth, look at the riches you have. Why do you live in such a house? And housing has taken up a greater and greater part of people's discretionary income. It's mopped up most of the gains to the 2-income household. 2-income household, great news for the government, you've got twice as many people to tax. Fantastic news for people who own property, we've got twice as many people to pay rent. For the 2 people themselves, let's say husband and wife, but we don't have to be gender specific, they've lost 35 to 40 hours of discretionary time every week in return for no improvement in their overall living standards.
那这个人住在哪里？
Now, if you're single in London, I don't sound weird, saying this campaign for the rights of single people, but unless you're earning megabucks, not being in a relationship or having a bunch of friends.
不过在同样的国家可以认识，我不知道这是谁。
On that, and on that, what sort of relates to a lot of stress and kind of potential mental health connotations. Yeah, absolutely right. I want to just switch your brain to mental health, almost flowing on from this conversation: property, cars, branding, marketing. Can you name a really cool mental health platform, business, charity? The reason why I ask is,
interesting question.
The reason why I ask that is that it affects all of us. It affects us in a positive way and a negative way, and we're all being told to talk more.
Really mischievous answer there.
No, I did what.
Okay, nobody's ever going to say this, but I'm going to be mischievous about it, which is, there are interesting, there are some really interesting moves, by the way, to explore recreational drugs as cures for certain mental health problems, including psychedelics. And all I can say is we need to explore those, because we created a ludicrously false dichotomy between recreational drugs and medicinal drugs. So the definition of a medicinal drug was one that wasn't enjoyable to take, almost. Okay, in other words, tasted horrible, and had unpleasant side effects. And as soon as a drug became enjoyable, we immediately said it's a recreational drug. Now, one of the side effects of that was nobody researched the positive upsides of recreational drugs. I'm not into it, apart from nicotine. I don't even drink very much.
Cannabis is a good example.
I'm also wary, by the way, I'm wary about it, complete legalization for complex reasons. Not because I think it's bad for 95% of people. It's probably a bit like alcohol, actually. It's probably neutral or beneficial for the vast majority of people, but catastrophically bad for a certain percentage. And often it's catastrophically bad for people who are in a bad way already. Gambling, well, I put it in the same category. General gambling, most people know how to handle it, they enjoy it to a reasonable extent. But there is a group of people who, for circumstantial or genetic reasons, and I've always sort of defended nicotine there. And I won't defend smoking anymore because you can vape. But my only defense of smoking is that the second order externalities of people smoking, although people complain about passive smoking and the smell, compared to alcohol or gambling or some other drugs, the knock-on effects to other people. Nobody ever says, I can't go into town on Saturday night because there are all these smokers there. Right? I made this point, if you're an unborn child and you were asked, would you like to be born into the household where the dad, say, is a heavy smoker, a heavy gambler, or a heavy drinker, you choose the smoker. Okay? Now, smoking is slightly different because it's quite bad for a lot of people. But you can argue that some behaviours are worse because they're catastrophically bad for a few people. So generally people didn't die at 20. I've known quite a lot of people who died in their 30s and 40s because of drink. I don't know anybody who's died in their 30s and 40s because of smoking. There's quite a few people who died in their 60s. Fair enough. There's a difference between a bummer and a tragedy. The only point I'd make is that I think there was a very interesting statistic, 95% of schizophrenics smoked. And one of the theories is it was self-medication. It helped.
Love you so much.
One of the things I think we need to be open-minded about, people like David Nutt, who are much more important than me, I've merely looked at the behavioural biases behind how we categorise drugs, and an investigation of the possible beneficial effects, because let's face it, if people are choosing to take these things, yes, there's a totally trivial explanation for that, which is they like to get out of their heads, but it's highly likely that psychoactive drugs might have beneficial effects if administered in the right way to people in particular circumstances. And of course, if you think about it, okay, you're a research company, or you're trying to get funding for research, you go, we're getting research ketamine, okay? It's going to be a lot more difficult to get funding for what looks like a highly kind of irresponsible study than researching some boring thing that might vaguely affect angina or whatever it may be. But this, we should be open-minded about this. That's all I'm saying. I'm kind of wary about the cannabis thing because my argument is that it almost certainly is really enjoyable and probably pretty harmful for a lot of people. But then what about the 5% of people for whom it's catastrophic?
I only asked about cannabis or brought it up because there are clearly, in my opinion, from the sort of experience I've got people around me that have explored it from a business point of view, there are really good benefits, health-wise, that are not about smoking a spliff.
CBD obviously is different from THC. You separate those.
Exactly, but just felt like it was untapped and it was almost like a no-go area because that's my point. And it's like, well, why would you not explore it? Because what if you could actually produce?
So I actually had to defend a colleague of mine who kind of almost got into trouble with HR for writing in favour of psychedelic research because it was considered, and I said, no. This is a business where if we can't ask slightly unfashionable questions here, we're not a proper advertising company anymore. I basically leapt in and said, I'm not sure I agree with her, but I absolutely agree with her right to raise the topic.
Is that constant with you? And what I mean by that is I use that analogy of going against the tide. For you to be able to get to the heart of a problem, to get to people's emotions from a marketing point of view, advertising point of view, you've got to basically turn around and sort of break tradition or stop. And where would you draw the line?
Well, here's a naughty one, which, okay, it's too early to say whether it succeeded, but I occasionally annoy my wife by, in very select areas, defending Donald Trump. Okay, my argument was, if you take the Middle East, my simple argument is, what the hell? People go, what the hell's he doing now? This is crazy. To which I often reply, it's not like all the rational people solve this problem, is it? We've had hundreds and thousands of highly educated, completely rational people looking at that problem, and no one's gone anywhere. Arguably, if you have a problem that seems immune to rational solution, the only sensible approach is to try something that doesn't make sense, because and actually, I would also argue that one of the things that entrepreneurs are really interesting in, I mentioned the fact that they have a fundamentally different way of valuing information. That information that they have that nobody else has, they see as much more valuable than information that everybody shares. So conventional people are looking for the consensus, and entrepreneurs are in fact looking for the counterintuitive or the deviant opinion. And by the way, you don't have to be 100% right to be a successful entrepreneur. If 20% of people do a weird thing, or even 5% of people do something which is the opposite of somebody else, there's still a business. If you get 100% or 5% of any particular, you're doing fine. But the interesting thing I always noticed with entrepreneurs is if you said something that was a bit counterintuitive or a bit mischievous even, if you say that to a bureaucrat, they become annoyed because it messes with their model of the world, and their model of the world is designed for neatness. Entrepreneurs take a completely different approach, which is the more counterintuitive or ridiculous the theory, the more likely they are to entertain it, because if it is true, which it may well not be, but if it is true, it's disproportionately valuable precisely because of its non-obviousness. I think that makes sense.
I love that. And a key part of our sort of connection, if you like, is the entrepreneur community. I came down to breakfast at the Ideas Fest event, and you were right in front of me, and that optimism, that sort of innovative, I used that word disruptive earlier, that sort of lives in that entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's something that I found really interesting and I thrive in, but I also wanted to...
you can't be a pessimistic opportunist, can you?
No. You see what I mean? I mean, it goes back to what you're saying, you're looking for something that there is no path. Back to what you're saying earlier, there's no process. And I thrive in that environment. Like, how can I make that happen? Looking around you, I have no idea how I'm going to get
They're a very good company, aren't they?
They are a good company. I wanted to... we touched on this just before we started filming.
Funny observation, by the way, combining mental health. I hope I can say this, but Dan Ariely, the behavioural scientist, says that when he deals with bureaucrats, In other words, people whose only interest is not the quality of the outcome or the value of the activity, but the adherence to process or adherence to policy. Dan said something very interesting. He said, when I deal with those people, I kind of know what it's like to be autistic, in the sense that I know what it's like to live in a world where you have a system of thought that is completely at odds with the people around you. Because he said, it's so alien to me, which is that you derive pleasure from stopping something happening on spurious kind of legalistic or technical grounds. To him, it's so counter to his nature that he says, this is literally an alien intelligence.
It's so interesting you want autistic side of things, because I was going to bring up ADHD. Yeah, we touched on it just before we started filming. And I'm conscious of time, this is probably the last bit we can open up.
Go on a little bit longer.
But yes, but this is really interesting.
If we're going to talk about ADHD, it'd be ridiculous to keep it to a tight schedule.
Exactly, we wouldn't be ADHD at all. And I've gone through my own personal journey with this, where I did first last year. I started to show real interest in the fact that there were so many people around me talking about it and saying it's because of their ADHD, or this is why ADHD allows them to have this hyper-focus, relentless energy. It's very weird. I think a lot of people with ADHD, because they also have this hyper-focus thing, it's never occurred to them they have ADHD because they're capable of supreme acts of concentration, and therefore they reject the diagnosis. Okay. And I'm 3 months into being diagnosed.
I've never been diagnosed. Having said that, I've never been tested. A daughter of mine has been. I don't see it as a problem, actually. I see it as... okay, let's talk about Helen... I need to remember her name. I think Helen Taylor at UCL. She's an academic who argues that neurodiversity is a natural evolutionary process, in the sense that groups which contain no neurodiverse people would be at a disadvantage in the evolutionary environment. Because if everybody sees things the same way, effectively your collective consciousness, your collective information gathering and information processing would probably get stuck in a local maximum. In other words, you need other people to see the world differently, sometimes to shake everybody out of their conformity. And her argument is that we've evolved to be neurodiverse, and it's a natural part of what makes us human. And therefore, diagnosing a minority mental state as necessarily something that needs to be medicalized.
No, this is really interesting.
I could say, well, maybe it's the environment that's wrong.
Totally.
You know that interesting thing? Okay, are you using the ruler to measure the table, or are you using the table to measure the ruler? I had a discussion once with Daniel Kahneman, and it always amuses me to take a Nobel Prize when I talk about something really trivial, about a speed camera on the M11 near Yugioh. And my argument is, if you have a speed camera that catches an unusual number of people, there are two possible interpretations. Either it's in the right place, because it's an area where loads of people speed, or it's actually in the wrong place, because what you've done actually near Duel on the M11 is you have a motorway where people are tuning down the M11 at 80 miles an hour, they suddenly see a sign that says 50, and a couple hundred yards further on there's this bloody speed camera, which makes more money than all the other speed cameras in Essex. Now, I would argue that's either because the drivers are in the wrong, or the signage is in the wrong place. In fairness, if you're going at 80 on a motorway, all your instincts say, do not brake unexpectedly, do not do anything dramatic on a motorway. And then you have a speed limit that demands that you decelerate very, very fast. And so your instincts come into conflict with the law, and your instincts win. And therefore, what the extraordinarily high rate of activation of that speed camera means is that you need to basically move the speed camera a bit down the road, or the 50 mile an hour limit. That there's something wrong with the sign, not with the driver. The signage is at fault, not the driver. Now, equally, in the case of ADHD, you might well argue that it's a perfectly normal, healthy mental state, which is only made difficult because of the environment in which we insist people operate.
ADHD.
I mean, our environment is totally unnatural compared to what we've evolved for. And so you might argue that all that is effectively, in a sense, demonizing a natural human mental diversity which is supposed to exist, simply because someone doesn't conform to a majority norm. We're generally not in favour of that in other fields like ethnicity or sexuality. So, ask the same question.
It's got the word disorder in it.
Yeah, I know.
And so you said
it's a superpower, perhaps.
And then you get told off for that. So this is the journey I've been on, right? So I had something that I've now been diagnosed with that's got the word disorder in. I've never felt. I felt.
You may learn about it as a property developer. You seem perfectly fine.
I don't feel like it's the superpower that I get. I totally get the reference to that. I am relentless when I'm focused on something. I have a disproportionate amount of energy compared to what other people might.
I would argue that the ability to concentrate for long periods of time on something that's boring and pointless, which is commonly found in bureaucrats, is a bigger disorder than the ability to get distracted from something that's a waste of time. Strict adherence to a kind of procedural neatness creates much more economic inefficiency than people with ADHD do, surely.
No, I totally get it.
The person from the council who can't make an exception, even though the context makes it absolutely obvious that the law shouldn't really apply, that's a far weirder and more annoying mind state, I would have thought.
But with your brain knowledge and all this incredible creativeness that you've got, what would you call ADHD?
Well, I mean, it's taking a spectrum disorders, but that's probably fair to say. And undoubtedly, it would be problematic in extremes, as are other spectrum disorders. Again, bear in mind, I'm not a psychiatrist in any way. This is where it becomes really interesting, because there's a book written by a guy called Joseph Fishkin, who's a law professor at UCLA, called Bottlenecks. I'm planning to interview him as part of the Bottlenecks podcast series, fairly obviously, as he's written a book called Bottlenecks. And he argues that we made this weird mistake, which seems perfectly intelligent. It's micro-rational, but macro-stupid. And what it is we're obsessed with equality of opportunity. Now, the first requirement, if you like, of equality of opportunity is you apply the same criteria to everybody. Now, the problem with that is it's notionally fair at the level of the individual, but it's collectively catastrophic because you overweight for certain qualities, like the ability to write essays or solve mathematical equations, and you underweight for other really valuable human attributes. So in other words, you probably change the order of people in the queue a bit and make it a little bit fairer for people from slightly worse backgrounds. But the problem is someone who's brilliant otherwise, but happens not to be brilliant at the criteria you've determined should dominate the sorting process, is at a completely unfair disadvantage. Now, I'll do an analogy here, okay? If someone's really good at chess, they're probably in some respect quite clever. I'd accept that. Can you say the opposite, that someone who's bad at chess is stupid? No. Now, similarly, if you take academia as a weird selection process, like 2, 1 and above, yes, I think you can confidently say that someone who gets 2, 1, assuming they haven't grade inflation, hasn't become completely insane. I mean, I was at Oxford visiting Oxford, go there, of course, but I was visiting Oxford the other day, and about 40% of people go first. Now, when I was at Cambridge, this is high standards, but when I was at Cambridge, it was, there were subjects where, like music, where nobody had got a first for 25 years. So there is grade inflation. But if you make that the criterion, now, yes, it's probably fair that someone who can do well under those circumstances is both reasonably committed and pretty bright and capable and will make a desirable employee. Yep, fair. I think, just as someone who's good at chess patently has some sort of special intelligence. But can you make the opposite assertion, which is someone who doesn't like writing essays about Thucydides is a bad employee? No. And the advertising industry used to be very interesting in this front because there are parts of the world where working in advertising was unbelievably unfashionable. So you couldn't really recruit, there are parts of the world, Switzerland famously, you were expected to go into banking or a large multinational. So if you went into advertising, it was basically like saying, my son's a crack addict or something. And so you had to recruit in a really imaginative, random way. And some of the people you recruited from completely non-standard sources turned out to be brilliant. And there are a whole bunch of advertising millionaires who came into the industry with no degree entirely by chance. And so what we've done is we've privileged fairness of process over quality of outcome. And I would argue that a good organisation needs a mix of talents that are complementary. That's how human society's evolved. The person in the tribe with ADHD was probably a pain in the arse in some respects, but disproportionately valuable in others. Same probably being for the person who has Asperging. Plenty of inventors, if you think about it, are not neurotypical. Plenty of entrepreneurs are not. At one stage, let me get this right, the majority, I think it might have been all but 3 of the people on the board of Tesco were dyslexic. So at some level, we've evolved as a social species, and there's a kind of complementarity to that. And what we're doing instead is we're saying, no, in order for successful people to feel virtuous and that they've entirely deserved their success, we must deploy this very narrow criterion for what it is to be legitimately successful, which is you go through that academic channel. And it's unbelievably, it's a bottleneck. Exactly why Fishkin called his book Bottlenecks. It's created this ludicrous bottleneck where there aren't even enough jobs for those people to begin with. So it's a shit show. Now, as I said, people who aren't good at chess are not stupid. People who are good at chess probably, I'm going to accept the fact that some grandmaster, although to be honest, I wouldn't want to spend an evening in the pub with them, they do have some really valuable mental capacity for pattern recognition, memory, whatever it may be, I don't know, but they're special. But and I'm saying that making academic attainment a criterion, the sole criterion, in the name of fairness, is just as stupid as making chess the sole criterion.
I get that.
Now, interestingly, in city trading, there were cases, I think, where they looked for traders among backgammon players because it was a complement, it was kind of predictive ability. The ability to think of different odds and different outcomes. Backgammon's actually a really interesting game.
I don't know.
And the ability to kind of think effectively to think of 5 possible futures at the same time was just really valuable in that.
That's breeding strategy, isn't it? That's creativity.
A guy called Dave Horry, an art director, not a copywriter, got a job in an ad agency because he turned up for an interview at 9 o'clock in the morning and he already finished the Times crossword. And actually, they looked at his work. I don't know what his work was like, but the fact that he finished the Times crossword before 9 a.m. was basically, okay, good enough, give you a try. Now, actually, people who are really good at word games, sensible ad agency, we probably should recruit a countdown champion every now and then, or something like that. And what we've done instead is it's got to be fair. Because if we start looking for different attributes,
to be honest, I don't know what they're writing
because
at times
one
either.
person can succeed on one basis and another person can succeed on another basis. But we haven't got a frame of comparison. So how can it be fair if we don't have a comparative frame of reference? And it looks intelligent through a very narrow pinhole. Once you take the bird's eye view of the whole thing, it's stupid. It's really, really stupid.
We are in a run out of time, and you are unbelievable to listen to. You are incredible to talk with. Your brain.
I'm undiagnosed, by the way.
I'm not diagnosing you. I'm complimenting you as a human being, but also that learned knowledge that you've got. It's clear, like you are someone that ever I need to go to a pub quiz with. It's just like you must know the most random things.
The football questions will come up, and I'll be absolutely used. This is another point about a pub quiz team. Right? What do you optimise for? Breadth.
Yeah.
Actually, the pub quiz team is a very, very good analogy. I could not be on any pub, although I did once recognise Wayne Gretzky from a photograph, which was a bit weird. But I actually probably okay on really obscure sport, but football is totally boring. You know the scandal about the West Midlands police refusing to police? I don't think they're going far enough. I refuse to allow anybody to attend any football match. I think they should be... All it means... Okay, how many other people think? One of the most annoying things about being middle class in 2025 is you've got to pretend to be interested in football. I'm just not. Okay, so it means there are a load of annoying people on the train every time there's a bloody match.
Oh my God, it's so
football is far worse than smoking in terms of its, passive football. Nobody ever talks about that, but it just brings massive annoyance to everybody else.
This is where the other bloke should be telling me, well, I'll fill in the football knowledge, and I can't. I don't know what to
I think we should extend that West Midlands police policy to all football games that no fans should be allowed to attend because it's just annoying.
Oh, I just realised my face is hurting from smiling and just being, I'm marinating in your voice. I don't want this to end, but it has to. But I'm going to just thank you for the speed of your brain and how busy you are with everything you do. You make time to come and talk with me and educate me.
In truth, one of the great problems we've got is we've privileged rational argumentation as a mode of decision-making over anything else. Now, that brings me back to my Trump point. It's not like all the rational people solve the problem. I'm not defending him in general. I think he's a deeply, disturbed and in many ways, unattractive human being in all manner of ways. But his ability sometimes just to go in and... Do you remember his surgical use of the word? A really interesting approach, which Americans are not good at, generally, in terms of foreign policy, is attacking both sides. They've been fighting each other for so long, they don't know what they're doing. And by the way, that mirrors, we were talking to a primatologist at Nudgestock, and there's an alpha male move in primatology, which is 2 junior chimps are fighting. Okay, and the big alpha male just goes in and bashes both of them. Now, it doesn't seem to be a sensible move by the sort of rational scheme of things, but for whatever reason, it's an instinctive manoeuvre which probably sometimes works.
I've got to stop. My face is hurting, and I can hear these guys all giggling and laughing behind camera. You are so awesome to speak with.
And that's been a joy. Likewise. Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got kind of Vulcan mind meld going on here. So
you're electric. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. What a joy. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So nearly all innovations in large corporations emerge as an act of subversion. The Dove campaign, when it first got started within Ogilvy and Unilever, basically was almost like, it was a bit Colonel Kurtz. Basically, a group of people, both client side and agency side, went rogue. Effectively, Nespresso only existed, I think, because they lied to Nestle about their financial figures for 2 years. Jeff Bezos, when he introduced Amazon Prime, several of the board members threatened to resign if he introduced it. When you go back on any case where any large organisation has done something worthwhile, it has almost always started as effectively an act of disobedience.
Hello everyone and welcome to the first edition of the IPA Making Sense podcast, where we'll be making sense of the complicated things in advertising and media today, and hopefully just making them a little bit more fun. Now I'm absolutely thrilled today to be joined by our first guest, the wonderful Rory Sutherland. Now Rory, of course, is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy, and he also founded Ogilvy's behavioural science practice. Rory was President of the IPA from 2009 to 2011 and created a behavioural science legacy that's lasted well beyond his presidential term. Now Rory's an author of a number of best-selling books, the most recent, of course, being Alchemy. So we're absolutely thrilled to have you on the podcast today, Rory.
Right, it's great to be back, yeah.
Fantastic.
In the bowels of the building.
I know.
I wish I actually signed a 70-year lease. It's the only time in my life I'll ever sign a 70-year lease on a building in Belgrave Square. But it came up for renewal while I was president.
Oh, fantastic.
And very interestingly, there was a small body of opinion that wanted to move somewhere cheaper. And I said, once you've done that, tempting though it may be, once you've done that, you're doomed.
Yes, it's very difficult to go back.
You know, once you're operating out of some shed in Lewisham, you're not really an effective professional body. And it's a peculiar thing, because effectively you end up spending quite a lot of your budget on what is a form of advertising, which is architecture and location.
Absolutely. And it kind of draws in quite nicely to the points that I was going to start with today. Is, you know, why do you think it is as an industry we're so focused on the idea of minimising risk and prioritising that over, I guess, things that are reportable versus things?
It depends. I mean, one of the things is that most people in business, albeit unconsciously, aren't really interested or primarily motivated by enriching the business for which they work. They're more motivated by the idea of justifying their own existence within the organisation. And then if you look at it through that lens of what is sometimes called defensive decision making, if you think about it, in most businesses, city trading would be an outlier, certain businesses would be an outlier, there's a huge asymmetry between upside gains and downside risk. Yeah. So you make a cock-up, you lose your job, you know, at worst it's career ending, okay? You have a multi-million-dollar idea, you get a pat on the back, maybe you get a promotion or a bonus, but you don't get to capture anything like the upside value in proportion to what you create. Whereas the downside risk is, if anything, slightly amplified. What might be a relatively small risk to the organisation is actually catastrophic to your own career and prospects. So that asymmetry strikes me as being fundamentally a bit problematic, which is why, of course, you need entrepreneurs. Because entrepreneurs are people who are obviously greater risk takers, in part because they are likely to gain a far greater proportion of any upside gains than they would do if they were working for a conventional sort of organisation.
Right, and I guess in terms of like the kind of the opposition of creativity and rationality, it becomes kind of problematic because, as you said, if your focus is on reducing the overall risk to yourself, because negative events are far more highly.
There are huge biases if you're interested in blame avoidance as the principal motivation. One of which is that it doesn't matter how bad the consequences of your decision, if the decision appeared to be made rationally, then you effectively have a get out of jail card. Whereas if you make a decision which involves intuition or instinct or any form of kind of tacit knowledge, and therefore you don't have that rational framework with which to defend your decision making, if that decision turns out poorly, you're dead meat.
Yes.
And so these sort of asymmetries are really, really important because, you know, there's a question really of, I would argue, that advertising agencies at their best were run a bit like family-run entrepreneurial businesses. In other words, they were effectively opportunistic because that was the only way you could survive in what was, you know, quite a brutal world. I would then say that the holding companies then turned what was a concession. You know, you went from being a concession within the holding company, to use department store language, to being part of a corporation. And I don't think those gains to scale and sort of scale efficiencies, which might or might not work in the media world, I don't think they work at all in the creative agency world.
And I mean, one of the quite interesting things, I guess, from going back to school days and the mathematical sense, is like showing you're working out. If you get to the right answer and you've shown if you get to the wrong answer and you've shown you're working out,
you're still okay. You're still okay. So an awful lot of business activity, you could include probably 50% of market research in this, is arse covering disguised as rigor. Because it's very, very difficult to tell the difference between someone who's doing a load of work effectively, or bringing in management consultants, effectively construct a rational framework to defend their decision making in the event of catastrophe. That behaviour looks very similar to someone who's seeking to make a very rigorous decision. And I mean, certain people like Gerd Gigerenzer, for example, has argued that you know, probably 20% of, or maybe even 40% of activity within a business, it may not look like it, but it's primarily motivated by that kind of defensive behaviour.
And that's quite interesting.
If you think about it, as consumers, we make pretty good decisions without having to deliver a PowerPoint deck or an Excel spreadsheet to explain why we bought one car rather than another car. And it's accepted that as individuals, we can act based on a mixture of rationality, calculation, and intuition, for instance. But we've created this very strange institutional form of decision-making where we regard it as a kind of triumph if we can remove any kind of instinctive or subjective judgment completely and present it as though it were a kind of high school maths question with a single right answer. And there's a very interesting book just come out by the very same Gerd Gigerenzer, which is about the value of intuitive thinking. In other words, intuitive thinking allows us, for instance, to take on board lots of different forms of information which may be incommensurable. In other words, we can make apples to oranges comparisons rather than apples to apples comparisons. And he argues that a large part of what you might call the devaluation and dismissal of the value of intuition was driven in the 19th century by a kind of sexism. That it was kind of believed that men were disproportionately rational and women were disproportionately intuitive. And therefore, you presented rationality as a kind of machismo in decision-making. But in fact, of course, intuition, nearly all the really important decisions we make, I mean, where to live, where to work, who to marry, you know, which air fryer to buy, the really important stuff, those are actually made using a very high degree of intuition. One intuitive element, of course, being brand preference, which is, well, you know, it's made by a reputable company. So, though it's, this is what I've always argued, it's not a guarantee of perfection by any means. means, but it is a reliable guarantee that the thing isn't going to be a crock of shit. Yes. Because Toshiba, stroke, whoever it may be, who makes the air fryer, they have a lot of reputational skin in the game. They've got a lot of sunk cost investment in their brand reputation. Therefore, it would not make business sense for them to promote a product which was subpar, let's say. It may not be optimal, but if you want to avoid crappiness, then brands are a really pretty good heuristic.
Absolutely. And I think what plays quite nicely is McDonald's. I mean, McDonald's.
It's the least worst restaurant in the world. I've never had an objectively bad McDonald's. Okay. Now, as I jokingly say, it's not very good if you want to take someone on a first date. If you want to show off, if you want to have a meal you'll remember for the rest of your life, it's not great. That's obviously that's what Nando's is for. But on the other hand, as a reliable guarantee that you won't get ill, you won't be ripped off, the food will be pretty palatable, your kids will eat it, the toilets will be clean, the location will be safe. If you add up all the non-negatives, it's amazingly impressive.
Yeah, and I think an interesting point on McDonald's. One of my favourite films is The Founder. Of course, it's a Ray Kroc, really, really good story. There's two interesting angles on there. There's one which is the rationality of why McDonald's was successful in terms of their production line approach, and then there's when Ray Kroc said, the thing that got it for me, it was the name McDonald's. He said that when he took the name from the two brothers,
and then proceeded to kind of always try and drive them out of business.
Yeah. So, I mean, what would you say that in that sort of example there is the kind of the thing that made that as a really successful?
He's actually right, of course, isn't he? And it doesn't occur to anybody because we're so familiar with McDonald's. But it is a case where it rose by any other name. I mean, it's impossible to say because we don't have the kind of factories. Had he called it Dave's or Ray's or Crocs? Well, Crocs, of course, would mean that he would have had to get into the extremely bizarre footwear business. But the interesting thing, I occasionally tease, probably unfairly, Greg Jackson with this. Greg Jackson's the kind of founder of Octopus Energy. And their original intention was to call themselves eco-green tech, or whatever it might be, but a deadly serious descriptive name. The bizarrest thing was that they only became known as Octopus Energy because their principal investor, which was called something like Kraken Capital, had a completely eccentric policy that you had to name any brand they invested in after some sort of secret.
Right.
It may not have been quite that specific. So, much to their annoyance, they were forced to brand as Octopus Energy. And actually, it's a former Ogilvy colleague of mine, Rebecca Dibb-Simpkin, who's also involved in quite a lot of the branding work. But had they not had this bizarre pink octopus on a purple background, I always tease Greg by saying, if you'd gone with the original name, you'd probably only have 15,000 customers by now. Best name story of all, though. I occasionally have this kind of copywriter anxiety, which is when you look at something and go, it's brilliant, but I could never have come up with that. And I always had that a little bit about the Creature Comforts TV campaign back in the 90s, when someone wrote, someone said, I like it because it's easily turn off and honourable. Yes. And I had this kind of crisis confidence as a copywriter. I thought, I didn't think I ever could have written that. And then I discovered they weren't actually written. They were recordings of market research groups, which Aardman then animated. So they would literally choose the most bizarre, sometimes the most boring people in focus groups. Actually, probably not focus groups, they're probably depth interviews. And then they pretty much just animate those sayings. So it was never written by a copywriter. Easily turn off and honourable was just said by a member of the public. But there was this other case. I always wondered who the hell came up with. Now, I'm not approving or endorsing it here, you understand. But I always wondered who came up with the name Spearmint Rhino. For a chain of gentlemen's clubs, if you're not familiar, apparently I've never been to one. No. Well, the Stringfellows, man. But no. But Spearmint Rhino, if you think about it, it's got two Freudian, suggestions of phallic imagery, right? And yet it's utterly bizarre, right? And yet it just works. And there is only one instance I can find anywhere where someone tells the story of why it was so named, which appears when the founder was interviewed in The Guardian about 12 years ago. And I finally found it online. And the reason is this. In order to expand, they bought a chain of children's restaurants to be repurposed as gentlemen's clubs, by which we don't mean sort of, the Institute of Directors or the Athenaeum. We mean gentlemen's clubs. And they bought this chain of restaurants just as a useful real estate move with which to expand. And the children's restaurants were called Peppermint Elephant. And they thought, well, we can't really have a chain of strip clubs called Peppermint Elephant. So they flipped it to Spearmint Rhino to make it a bit more kind of brand appropriate. And there you have it. But when you think about it, I mean, it is this awful question of brand names because we never know what would have happened otherwise. It would be very, very easy. Okay? If you had a silly name like Octopus Energy and you'd failed, everybody would have gone, if you only called it something serious, we'd be $1 billion company by now. So it's very, very difficult. The tendency is, because you'll never be able to prove it one way or the other, the tendency would always be to go with boring rather than silly. But when you think about it, I mean, huge numbers of very successful things have utterly stupid names, not just Spearmint Rhino. I can never understand who the hell came up with Murder, She Wrote. Do you remember that?
Of course, yeah.
I mean, for a TV programme, Murder, it's just ridiculous. And so every now and then you get these, when you think about it, Strictly Come Dancing, okay, it's a pun on Strictly Ballroom. Fucking stupid name, isn't it? Really, really stupid name. Doesn't, and now it's just called Strictly. It doesn't really make any sense, does it, right?
No, absolutely.
I mean, what the hell? And so the courage actually just, maybe we're getting into kind of bar and shop territory here, which is just be distinctive. Just call yourself something slightly ridiculous and just hope for it. But it takes an awful lot of courage because you're the guy who's going to be, if you do boring advertising and the product launch fails, you're safe, okay? If you do wacky advertising and the product launch succeeds, well, all the people who did the pricing and the product design will take all the credit. If you do wacky advertising and the product launch fails, everybody's going to blame you. And so the necessity of, the difficulty of being weird, whether it's, it's not pink, it's coral, the card which is the Monzo card, the difficulty of doing those things. And it's pathetic to call it bravery. I mean, people fighting in Ukraine. But what I mean is the chutzpah required to do something weird in business, given the unevenness of the consequences that result. And as a consequence, business is just a lot more boring than it needs to be.
Yeah, but I think in terms of, I know you've been talking quite a lot recently about the idea of family-owned businesses, and one of the ones that really resonates with me is Pneumatic, the maker of the Henry vacuum cleaner.
Are they family-owned?
Yeah. I can't remember the guy's name who owns them. I'm 99% sure they are. But
Dyson is also family-owned. So the two really interesting ends of the marketplace, apologies to my mate who's the marketing director of Electrolux, but the two really interesting extremes of the marketplace are both family-owned companies.
But the weird thing with Henry is it was obviously designed as a kind of industrial vacuum cleaner, and it was guys at a trade show who got board and then drew a face on it. And then all of a sudden, like in terms of like, the product.
You can get a Hetty as well, can't you? How is the Hetty different? There's a George as well.
Hetty has eyelashes and is pink.
That's right.
George, I think.
But a Hetty and Deal, actually. The Hetty, yeah.
I was talking recently, I was on another podcast. I mean, Henry is kind of, I call it like the Keith Richards of the vacuum cleaner world. It's just unbelievably powerful and strong. You can use it. It's the only
Interestingly, a colleague of mine, Malcolm Poynton, it was always his fantasy to do the advertising for Henry.
And they don't advertise.
Well, no, they don't seem to. And his argument was, it's very simple, that everywhere you go, which effectively needs an industrial strength vacuum cleaner. You know, you're sitting, I don't know, if you're late, you stay late at a restaurant, whatever it may be, if you're in a hotel, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the people are always using Henrys, aren't they? And yet, bizarrely, they've managed to kind of straddle the B2B and consumer markets very effectively.
And they're incredibly cheap as well.
And it's interesting because it's only, I think, the family-owned business, and we have evidence here, but it's only anecdotal, but it's not insignificant. 4 out of the 5 IPA Effectiveness Gold Awards this year were family-owned businesses, and I presented this so often I can reel them off. Laithwaites, Specsavers, McCain, and Yorkshire.